Good evening. Sounds more like folks are alive here. At this point, what we're going to do, certainly people are still coming in. What we're going to do, we're going to ask the moderators if you can just please kind of come up to the podium here. I'm sorry, the moderator and the panelists, if you all can just kind of come and take your position here. Actually, the moderator, you can relax for a few minutes, and you'll take my spot when I leave here. Again, appreciate all of you who are here tonight. If we can maybe have, I hate to do this, but if we can kind of have some of the folks that are way in the back kind of come up a little bit so we can all be cozy together, huh? And a little bit of friendliness and rubbing elbows with folks that you never met and maybe folks that you've seen but never really introduced yourself to. So this will be a great opportunity to really know some new faces. Well, thank you. My name is Eric Beta, and I'm over the Office of Intercultural Relations here at Spring Arbor University. Certainly thank you all for being here tonight. I know there's a lot of other folks who are still kind of making their way here. We're here certainly for, to me, a very important event tonight. We are celebrating this event in the month of Black History Month. But tonight the event is more than just Black History Month tonight. It's really about American history. It's an opportunity to really talk about some things that many times that easily make headlines in the media. Some of you may be aware of recent issues that we had. The Trayvon Martin event easily went viral on the internet. Racially inspired, as some would say, or some have different opinion about it. But whatever the facts are on the matter, race certainly had a huge implication in the sight of the media. So tonight we gather here to talk about just that. Racial stereotypes in America. How does that impact us as Americans? How does that impact our decision making? How does that impact our view of one another? How does that impact our approach to one another? We at Spring Arbor University, we strive to push and to do things about the subject of diversity. As an institution, we currently have 11% of our student body is made up of students of color on this campus. As an institution, which includes not only our main campus, but also our satellite locations, we're at 23%, which is far more than many other institutions can say. So certainly we're making progress. We're making some very good strides towards the subject of diversity and to be a more diverse institution. However, along the way of diversity, the discussions of diversity, there's always what I consider misunderstanding and, how should I say, things that may not be clear because of maybe cultural differences or different understanding. So tonight, I feel that this event will give us a great opportunity to really deal with some things about race and stereotypes and really things maybe sometimes we're not very comfortable saying to others in open forums. But really, we think about it. Some may bother us, some may not. But tonight, I think this is a great opportunity to really talk about some of those things and to have the opportunity to learn some things along the way so that when we leave here, we become more informed. We become more engaged citizens. We become more educated, and we make sound decisions accordingly. So with that, we're going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to allow our Vice President of Student Development to come and give a welcome to you all on tonight. Is that all right? Thank you. I've got a response back there. Thank you. So I'll start with the first one here. Dr. Forrest Carter. Dr. Forrest Carter is currently an associate professor of marketing in the Eli Bro School of Business at Michigan State University, where he teaches courses in marketing research, marketing strategy, and entrepreneurship. He is also the faculty director of the Business College's Institute for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. Dr. Caleb Chan. Dr. Chan served as the Dean of Gainey School of Business at Spring Arbor University. As an ethnic Chinese born and raised in Hong Kong, Dr. King's area of expertise includes statistics, international business, competitive strategy, and cross-cultural study. In his 20 years of service at Spring Arbor University, he has been involved as part of the evaluation team of the PhD Pipeline Opportunity Project since 2011. And the pipeline is established to mobilize and assist underrepresented students to pursue PhD in business. Dr. Jennifer Cobbina is an assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. Her primary research focuses on the issues of corrections, prisoner reentry, and the understanding of recidivism and distance among recently released female offenders. Her second primary research area is centered on examining how gender and social context impact victimization risk among minority youth. Dr. Cobbina's work appears in many criminal justice publications. Our fourth one, Mary Darling. Mary Darling is an associate professor of communication at Spring Arbor University. She is a co-author with Dr. Tony Campolo of 2 books. The first, Connecting Like Jesus, Practices for Healing, Teaching and Preaching. And the other, The God of Intimacy and Action. She also serves on the committee of her church. The committee is called Set Free. It's called the Set Free Team, a movement to help abolish modern slavery. Dr. John Hawthorne is the chair of the Department of Sociology and Global Studies and Criminal Justice at Spring Arbor University. He has devoted his career to Christian higher education, serving as classroom teacher and administrator. Chuck Jackson. Chuck Jackson is the Executive Vice President and Chief Clinical Officer at Starr Commonwealth. He has served troubled youth and their families with Starr Commonwealth since 1988. He is also the Executive Director of Starr Vista, a care management organization serving the at-risk and delinquent population of youth residing in the greater Detroit area. Richard Marsh, Jr. Rich Marsh is the city manager of Inkster, Michigan. As a city manager, he is the chief administrative officer for the city of Inkster and is responsible for all city departments except the city clerk's office and the city attorney's office. He is committed to providing the best services possible to residents of Inkster. One of his initiatives is to change the image of the city of Inkster by countering the negative stereotypes portrayed in the media. And last but not least, Dr. Theodore Ransaw. Dr. Ted Ransaw is an assistant professor in the School of Education at Michigan State University. Dr. Ransaw is the Achievement Gap Specialist for males of color and the K-12 Outreach Specialist in the Michigan State University College of Education. His research streams include masculinity in education, fatherhood, mentorship, and rites of passage. With that, please give our hand to our panelists. At this time, if we can allow Dr. Kimberly Hayworth to come up to give a Spring Arbor University welcome, and followed by Pastor Mark Van Valen to give our invocation.
Good evening and welcome. I'd like to bring you greetings on behalf of President Ellis. He would love to be here this evening if he hadn't already had an engagement that really had been planned for about 3 years. It is in a warmer climate. I'll go ahead and put that out there so you all know. He's in Boca Raton, Florida right now with a group of donors and other staff from the university. But he does send his greetings, and I do know that he would be here tonight if he were in town. So welcome to Spring Arbor University. Welcome on behalf of President Ellis, and I look forward to an evening spending that with you and hearing wise comments from our panelists. And I believe I'm to introduce Pastor Mark Van Valen. He's the pastor of the Spring Arbor Free Methodist Church, which we do thank the church for collaborating with us on this event and allowing us to hold it here.
Well, we are honored to host this event, and I thank Eric for choosing our venue for this event. I want to lead us in prayer. I just want to say one thing. If you read the book of Ephesians, the first chapter of that letter says, the central organizing principle and power of the universe is reconciliation in Christ. And it's in Christ and Christ alone that all racial, ethnic, caste, tribal division and violence is eradicated. Because all those are based on natural birthright. But in Christ we are reborn by divine birthright. And so I think it's right that we're here today, and I'm thankful for this opportunity for us to be together, and Eric, for your work in pulling this together. So thank you. Let's stand together, and let's offer this evening to the Lord. Father, this is work that you want done, and we thank you that we are motivated and we are compelled by your grace and your love in Christ Jesus. We ask that you would speak to us, speak through us, shape us, stretch us, break us, mold us to be more like you. We thank you for this panel. We pray for the discussion. We pray for the truth. And we offer this time as our gift of worship to you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Amen. You may be seated.
At this time, I'd like to welcome Gloria Bang, who is a student here at Spring Arbor University, to introduce our moderator. So at this time, please give a hand to Gloria and my students.
Ms. Faye Beydoun is a visionary leader who has devoted her career to serving the business community and the community at large. Since leading the American Arab Chamber of Commerce in 2008, Ms. Beydoun has reused her talent and expertise to benefit the Chamber and the community at the local, national, and international level. In 2002, Ms. Beydoun expanded her circle of activities to enhance the relationships between the United States and the Middle East. She became Vice President of the U.S. Arabic Economic Forum, an organization that facilitates economic collaboration, culture dialogue, and innovation between the United States and the Middle East. Ms. Beydoun also serves as the Chief Operating Officer of the American Middle East Economic Affairs Committee, which works to further economic relations between the United States and the Arab world. It has initiated projects such as the U.S. Arab Economic Forum, U.S. Arab Women's Business Council, the U.S. Arab Leadership Program, and many more. Since joining the American Arab Chamber of Commerce, Ms. Beydoun has reached out to various business, governmental, and economic organizations to facilitate the growth of Arab American business and the community at large. The American Arab Chamber of Commerce is the largest Arab American business organization in the United States, delivering services and the counsel under Ms. Beydoun's leadership to more than 1,200 companies ranging from small businesses to multinational corporations and executive professionals. Among her numerous awards, she was recently awarded the Michigan Women's Foundation Top 25 Women Making a Difference Award and Core Magazine 2011 Diversity Leader Award. Ms. Beydoun is also Chief Operating Officer, American Middle East Economic Affairs Committee, U.S. Arab Economic Forum, Tazara Global Development Center Executive Co-Chairwoman, Council of Ethnic Chambers of Commerce. Now we welcome Ms. Faye Beydoun for our monitor for tonight.
Thank you, Gloria. You did a wonderful job with doing that. I didn't recognize myself. In a survey entitled Student Perceptions on Campus Cultural Climate by Race by Julia Annis and Jonathan Moore in a Journal of Counseling and Development, it was noted among African Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanic and Caucasians, African Americans have reported the more significant racial conflicts on campus. The New York Times article dated November 15, 2013, entitled Disrespect, Race, and Obama. Some say the obstacles President Obama is facing with Congress can be attributed to the fact that he is an African American. Others say we have officially reached a post-segregation era when President Obama was elected as the first person of color to lead this nation. Other issues in the news: the Trayvon Martin shooting, or Theodore Paul Wafer, a white man charged with the manslaughter for the murder of Renisha McBride in Detroit. In spite of these issues, most Americans agree that stereotypes should have no part in our society. I'd like to ask our panelists to just chime in after I read the first question. After viewing the video, would you describe justice as justice colorblind? I'm going to ask the panelist on my left to start.
Could you repeat that question one more time?
Would you describe justice as justice colorblind?
First of all, I'd like to say that I'm not an expert in race relations. When I speak, I'm speaking from personal experiences I've engaged in, and also maybe those around me. So it's my worldview. And being a city manager and being responsible and being a city manager in several cities, in fact 4, part of my role is to be the manager overseer of the police chief and entire police departments. And I've had instances where I had to bring in people to train police officers and how they needed to treat all people equally and fairly, and how we needed to stay away from this tendency at times that some have. And by the way, I like to say most of the police departments I've been with, 98% have been great. I'd say about 90% of the officers, but you always have those challenged people, just like in life. And I had to bring in people for racial relation training. I had to bring in people to talk about how we need to stay away from that urge to engage in disparity of treatment and stereotyping. In fact, an interesting thing happened to me as a city manager. I happen to have a very old car, but it's clean, 13 years old, 168,000 miles. I like to ride in cars without a note, and it's a Mercedes, drop top. I'm getting off of work about 10:30 at night, city manager of this particular town, new, and I'm pulled over by a police officer for no reason. Wasn't speeding, seatbelt on. He happened to ask me, "What are you doing in this neighborhood? I haven't seen you around here before." I said, "Sir, I had a very long day at work. I'm on my way home. No, I don't live in the immediate area. I just recently got hired by the city, and I live about 30 miles away from here." He said, "Oh, what do you do?" I said, "I'm your new city manager." He said, "Oh, wow, that's nice. You know, I've heard a lot of good things about you." And I said, first of all, and Pastor, thank you so much, because the Bible talks about that police officer ministers for good. And the Bible speaks, it's a very high position that they hold. And when I meet with my police officers, I reference the scripture. And I thank them for serving. And I thanked him for serving. And I told him I honored his position and what he was responsible for doing in our community. I had to go back to the police chief, and I had to ask about this particular guy who happened to be a sergeant, and he had a pattern of engaging in disparity of treatment with when it came to African Americans versus non-African Americans in our community. And I asked, what kind of training have we provided this gentleman? We hadn't. Coincidentally, about a month later, he came up for promotion to be a lieutenant. And of course, I have to sign off on those things. And based on the background and the history and even a couple lawsuits against us and against him in particular, I had a pause when it came to promoting that person, because in leadership, you tend to say, you set the atmosphere and you set the tone for those that you're responsible for. And I didn't support that promotion because of the history and also the lawsuits against this particular officer, and what I perceived to be the tone that he would set of accepting behavior that I found to be unacceptable, and we're trying to get him some help. So to answer your question, yes, justice sometimes, there is disparity and there are double standards quite often.
Thank you. I will have two more questions regarding justice disparities, but is there someone on this side that would like to comment on the first question?
One of the things that struck me during the video was the reference to the white neighborhood. And when you look at the nature of ongoing residential segregation and the self-separation that happens, and then your story as well, what are you doing driving in this white neighborhood, suggests that the justice issue is not a matter of being blind, it's justice kind of being bent toward where one happens to be, and justice has different meanings depending on location.
I just want to add to that the only thing that kept going through my mind as I was watching the video, what if the three people that were sleeping in the car were Asian? What if they were Hispanic? And how many calls would have came in if they were Arab American or Middle Eastern looking? We're going to go on our next question, which is about 14 million whites and 2.6 million African Americans report using illicit drugs. Yet African Americans are sent to prison for drug offenses at 10 times the rate of whites. Why are there more African Americans in prison for drug offenses compared to whites?
Okay. Well, I would have to say there's a couple of reasons why there's more African Americans in prison for drug offenses. One largely being the war on drugs. The war on drugs started in the 80s, and I'm sure many of you are aware that crack cocaine is generally the drug of choice for African Americans, while powder cocaine has been the drug of choice for white individuals. However, since the 1980s, 500 grams of powder cocaine will result in a 5-year sentence, but only 5 grams of crack cocaine would result in the same sentence. And so there's a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity with regards to powder cocaine and crack cocaine, even though both drugs are pharmacologically identical. But even with that, I should say that just in 2010, the Fair Sentencing Act was passed, and essentially it changed the ratio. Instead of 5 grams of crack cocaine resulting in a 5-year sentence, it's now 28 grams. So the disparity is not quite as big. So the disparity is not quite as big. However, there is still a disparity nonetheless, and I should say the Fair Sentencing Act is not applied retroactively. So even though we have the Fair Sentencing Act, we have thousands of individuals who committed drug offenses who are languishing in prison, and it's not applied retroactively. If they were sentenced under the old law, they're still going to be in prison. But there is good news. Just last month, I found out that there's a smarter sentencing act that was passed which extends the Fair Sentencing Act. So essentially this act would be applied retroactively so that individuals who are in prison for drug offenses, and if they would have been released according to the new law early, they will be released. And so that's one reason. The war on drugs is one reason why there are so many African Americans in prison for drug offenses. Then the other reason I would say has to do with mandatory minimum sentences. For those of you who are not aware, mandatory minimum sentences specify that a required amount of time behind bars has to be served for committing a certain crime like drug offenses. And the whole purpose of mandatory minimum sentences was really to provide equal treatment so that individuals who commit certain types of crime are all going to get the same type of offense regardless of one's age or gender or sex or any other personal characteristics. However, we know that significantly African Americans are impacted by mandatory minimum sentences. The U.S. Sentencing Commission actually reported in 2010 that African Americans are 21% more likely to receive mandatory minimum sentence than white defendants, and they're much more likely to be sentenced, have stiffer penalties compared to white individuals. So those are two main reasons I would argue that there are significantly more African Americans in prison for drug offenses compared to white.
Okay, thank you. African Americans represent 12% of the total population of drug users, but 38% of those arrested for drug offenses and 59% of those in the Michigan State Prison for a drug offense are African Americans. Is the frequent arrest of African Americans intentional or coincidental? If intentional, what can we, the people, do to change the direction of the system?
Okay, I'll jump in. Hi, I'm Dr. Ransaw. Most of my students call me Ransaw, so Ransaw by itself is fine. I want to thank everyone for coming, and I'm going to push on things a little bit, and I'm going to assume that most of us in the room aren't really part of the problem. I think everyone is here looking for a solution, so I want to start off with that, so I appreciate that. We talked just a few moments ago, Nancy Reagan, we talked about the war on drugs. So around, when Nancy Reagan was First Lady, she had this phrase called, just say no. Okay, some of you are from around that era, right? So just say no, the reason why that was important is just say no started the thinking behind the war on drugs. And shortly after, or right around the same time, her husband, Ronald Reagan, came up with these ideas in this initiative for war on drugs and severe penalties for carrying drugs. And so how this translated into schools is that if a student had drugs on campus, they're automatically suspended. And what this translates to a little bit later on is zero tolerance policy. So we had that first. Right after that, we had a strict gun control law, and then any student carrying a gun was automatically suspended or expelled from school. And so the reason why that's important is we look at zero tolerance policy, it has a pattern. And how zero tolerance policy plays a role into police and incarceration and some of the other things. We all have heard, and we talked a little bit about earlier, the Trayvon Martin case. Well, if we look at the Trayvon Martin case, Trayvon Martin was actually suspended from school when he was in Florida. So had he been in a classroom and not suspended, things may have gone a little bit different. So if we think about patterns and was it intentional or not, going back to the first one, we talked about just say no. So if you're a student on campus, as one young lady was on campus, I think she was in junior high school, she had menstrual cycles. Some ladies start their menstrual cycle early, junior high school, right around the same time, but a little bit early. She took aspirin to school for her menstrual cramps, automatically expelled from school. So zero tolerance policies, how that affects African American males. And we had some excellent background information. African American males in the classroom we know that they're put in suspension and detention and expulsion more. But once an African American male in the classroom is accused of an infraction, they are expelled or placed in detention or supervised detention longer for the same exact infraction as a white student, almost 2 to 3 times as longer. But in addition to that, if we look at some of the other patterns in the United States, and we just talked about this a few moments ago, African American males who are accused of a crime, once they actually get convicted of a crime, they have longer sentences than their white peers for the same exact infraction. So whether you believe African American, because it's possible that African American males could have committed more crime, I don't believe so, but let's just say that's possible. But once they get convicted of the crime, they still have a longer time in prison. So if you look at, if you're expelled from school and you have a longer expulsion rate than any other ethnic group, and if you're convicted of a crime, you have a longer incarceration than any other group. Well, that kind of seems like it could be a pattern, because once you're kicked out of school, like Trayvon Martin, some things could happen, but the more time you're out of school, the more time you have for instruction. So that's a pattern. And as we all know, or hopefully most of us know, that most of the people who have been incarcerated have a low reading level and low education level, so that's a repetitious pattern. So if we look at social justice and what zero tolerance policies and what's been called the school to prison pipeline, you may have heard of that, so that once you're suspended or expelled, you're more likely to wind up in prison. Interestingly enough, most of the African American males in the United States get their GEDs from where? In prison, more so than regular schools, which is interesting. But I'll be very brief. Give me one other minute, and then I'll release the mic. But if we look at patterns, and is this a pattern, is it intentional? I don't know if the room is aware of this, but there has been a pattern, a historical pattern, about denying African Americans education. In the United States, in the very beginning, it was illegal to teach a slave how to read. Right? So you may have heard of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass learned how to read. He was sitting at the feet of his master's wife, and she was teaching him to read the Bible. His slave master came in and said, "Don't teach that N-word how to read. If you do, there'll be no keeping him." So he decided to, from the meager ration that he had as a slave, he would sell pieces of food from his plate so he could have the white students around him teach them how to read. That's how we learned it. That's how bad it was. So if we look at that, and we look at segregation, and we look at denying African Americans the ability to read, you can look and see that it's almost a clear pattern. But to push on this just a little bit more, so around 1940s, 1945, 1950s, right after we had war on drugs, gun policy, by 1955 was the first time that we had more prisons built than colleges, right around the same time that those laws enacted. So if we look at, quote unquote, the school to prison pipeline, I don't know if a lot of you are aware of this, and Pastor, forgive me for a moment, how many of you have been to Victoria's Secrets? Okay, you don't have to raise your hand, Pastor's watching. Okay. I kind of like Victoria's Secrets, but anyway, they have nice lotion. For a long time, Victoria's Secret's products were made by incarcerated people in jail. So we also have TWA, a lot of the people who take your credit card information and book your flights are incarcerated felons. So not only are there incarcerated felons who are doing this, they get paid very low wages, but they hold people's credit card numbers, these incarcerated felons. So not only do we have African American males who've been denied historically the ability to read, educate themselves, substandard education, all of those things, but once they make it to prison, then they're forced to work for low wages. So it's not really in anyone's interest to educate black males. One last thing, and I'll finish up. So what? We're all here, we're all enlightened individuals, and I think everyone here is kind of on the right track. But a long time ago, in a place far, far away, United States, they taught the history of America from a historical perspective. They taught it from one perspective, that whites were slaves, the blacks were slaves, and whites were slave owner. They neglected the fact that the first slaves in the United States were Irish women. Irish people were enslaved before even Native Americans, even before that. So at some points in slavery, most whites weren't that much better off than African Americans, even African Americans that were slaves. The first instances we have of affirmative action were when whites were upset because they were losing jobs to free labor. That's the first form of affirmative action. So why is that important? Well, if whites and blacks were the same a long time ago, what happened? Well, what happened is blacks and whites got together and they tried to overthrow government in Virginia. Anyone ever heard of Bacon's Rebellion? Well, that was quashed. And shortly after that was quashed, they may have miscongregation laws. So previous to that, whites and blacks could be together. But after that, whites and blacks were forced to separate. Segregation, separation, weren't allowed to have kids. And why? Well, because the blacks and whites realized that the same folks who were slave owners then, there's a very small group of whites, not the majority of whites, who ripped off everybody back then. And if you look at the banks who ripped us off recently, Aetna, Wachova, some of those banks earned their money and their finances based on slave labor. So what does that mean? Well, the blacks and whites realize what's really going on, and we get back together, work together like we should. If we tried to take over the government again, I wonder what would happen.
Sure, but I'm going to have to limit your time a little bit. Go for it.
Very quick. I'm unabashedly a social worker. So I started my career in Detroit working with these kids that we're talking about, drug dealers, many of the young men I worked with. And so in response to the question, is stereotyping affecting this? Yes, certainly it is. But I think what's more important is the impact it has on the beliefs and the behaviors of those who are being stereotyped. One of the things that we think about is, well, African Americans are more apt to be criminals. And it does not change as you get older. I mean, I live in a world where I see how white people react to me just walking up. It doesn't matter how I'm dressed. There's this initial shock or fear of what's he gonna do. But my point that I'd like to make, though, is the question that we don't often ask is, why are so many young men or young women in inner cities who are poor, why are they selling drugs? Why are they using drugs? When you talk to many of them, what you find is many of them are doing this to feed their families. They're doing this to survive. They're doing this to live. Now, that doesn't justify it. That doesn't make it right. But it takes a different perspective when you understand. Now, the stereotyping comes in. I'm an easier target. I'm African American. I'm in an inner city, poverty-stricken area. I'm targeted. But the challenge for us is to think about why. Why are so many young people, or why did so many young people turn to drug dealing as a means to support themselves and their families? I've worked with hundreds of those young people, and most of them were decent human beings who were simply trying to find a way, misguided, misjudged, and they were selling drugs because they had no food in the refrigerator. My mom was an alcoholic, and I have to feed my siblings. So we have to also think about the human side of this and the difference in that there are human beings involved in this. The stereotyping, I think, is what strips away the humanity. You become something based on what you look like, and we just need to come back to the humanity involved in all of our activities.
Sure.
I did want to add something really quick. There's a lot of people who think that African Americans are much more likely to use drugs than whites. However, that's not true. In 2012, there was a study done by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and they did a study on secondary students from 1975 up until 2011. So it wasn't just done at one point in time. It's a longitudinal study over 30 years. And what they found is that white students were more likely to self-report drug use than African American students. And the same holds true for adult populations. African Americans are not more likely to use drugs than whites. They're not more likely to deal drugs than whites. And actually, studies show that people tend to, drug users tend to buy drugs from people of the same race. White individuals will purchase drugs from whites. Black individuals will purchase drugs from blacks. If you're in college, you're going to purchase drugs from other college students. And so we need to dispel the myth that African Americans are using drugs at substantially higher rates, which then justifies or explains why more of them are in prison. The fact of the matter is, self-report studies show that that's not true.
Thank you. No, this is very important, and the comments, yeah, please do. Go ahead.
Very brief, because I'm speaking from personal experiences from being a city manager. And I wish I could talk, but this forum is not to talk about the positives, because I have more positives to talk about regarding our honorable police officers than negative. Many more positives, almost 100-fold. But since this conversation regarding, some of the disparities, I have, and you can Google this, but there were, is it intentional? Yes, it happens sometimes. And an example I'll give you, there's 2 officers who were sued. There's a class action suit by African Americans. And these officers also are spending time in prison right now after a grand jury investigation into the fact that they had planted drugs on African Americans, that falsified police reports, which led to warrants being issued for those African American young men. And these young men were put in prison for something they did not do. And change, we talk about change. How do we change that? Pastor, this is just my worldview. I believe prayer. The Bible says the prayer of a righteous man availeth much. I also think that's important that those who believe in Scripture and are submitted to the Word of God, that we influence them to take on leadership roles of position and influence and authority so they can utilize the biblical principles in the workplace so we can reach that dream we have of reconciliation and justice for all. There's other groups like the Human Relations Commission that can assist in that change in these forums as well.
Thank you. So apparently it's very evident we're going to need prayer. We're going to need some education, and we're going to need some understanding. So hopefully one day we will get there. According to the New York Times, unemployment rate among people of color, specifically blacks, is nearly, and in some places like Miami, Florida, it is double the national average. Can those issues be attributed to findings by researchers where resume for the same job applications will get twice as many callbacks for interviews if the name on the resume is Greg instead of Jamal, Jose, or Chang?
I guess I better answer these questions because there's my name on the question.
Especially, exactly, thank you.
If you asked me that 21, 22 years ago, if this is true, well, I said, yeah, because I couldn't get a job until I applied to Spring Arbor University, and they called me and said, well, are you still interested? Sure. I have a young family, and my son just came out of the hospital. He was 4 days old, and so I need a job. I want a job, so then I came here. But honestly, I think back then the economy has changed. So in my case, I couldn't really blame on my name. My being Asian American has nothing to do with my not getting jobs. When my people I know who went to school with me, maybe a year or 2 older, they got multiple offers. But it was around the time that we hit the recession. But it's God's guidance that He brought me here. But what I'd like to maybe take this question and look at it from a different angle is what instead of looking at the entry point of a career, the employment situation, but maybe look at a different place of career development. There's something that has been coined as the bamboo ceiling for the Asian Americans. So if I could address might be some stereotypes of for Asian Americans, and I'm going to involve the audience if it's okay. I'm going to share several stereotypes. If you have heard of these stereotypes for Asian Americans, would you raise a hand? Okay. Number one, American Asians cannot drive. They're terrible drivers. Okay, good. I did not make it up. Two, they go back in the back order. American Asians don't know how to speak English. They speak Chinglish, Chinese English, or some other combination. The next one, an Asian is a doctor. They can be a doctor, but definitely not a lawyer, and not Indian chief, meaning CEOs. Not many, a few more. Or Asian Americans cannot play sports, but they are martial artists. All right. The next one. All Asian Americans are socially awkward. They're not people-oriented. They're shy. Okay, you have not heard of it. How about Asian Americans are Democrats? Bill, okay. Asian Americans work hard. Okay. And how many of you also have heard of, say, it's like what the two sides of the coin. You can say what Asian Americans, they're intelligent. But the people might also say, well, they are, let me see, what would be another way to look at Asian Americans who are intelligent? What about the lack of personality? Oh, yeah, these Asian Americans are family-oriented. Nah, they're clannish. They're unfriendly. They isolate themselves. What about the hardworking? Oh, they're unfairly competitive. So we can't have these stereotypes that would affect what the way we look at, say, different people, and we can't also affect society in different ways. Some people might be denied opportunities if they are billed as, Asian Americans, and you are tech savvy. But while you're not people-oriented, so that might affect what someone's career advancement, professional development. So I'll stop here.
I'm not going to get into the stereotyping of Arab Americans. I'm still thinking about the Asians.
If I could, I'd like to come back to. I'll just talk. I'll come back to the question about unemployment and those patterns. I think one of the really troubling things is the stability of that statistic. That when you look, it doesn't really matter what time period you want to pick, that the black unemployment rate across the board is twice whatever the white unemployment rate, or whatever the national unemployment rate is. And that's been true regardless of economic cycle. And because it's true regardless of economic cycle, to me that raises questions that go well beyond the stereotyping question about who's applying for the job. It has much more to do with access to jobs, the kinds of issues we were raising here about what's going on in the cities and the neighborhoods and what's available to that. And as well as the comments made earlier about the nature of education. And so to say, well, everybody should go, that I'm old enough to remember that same president that was married to the just say no lady. The argument there was that, well, there's plenty of jobs. Somebody should just go apply for that computer programming position. Well, if you were dealing with those issues in the city school with all the varieties of issues that deal with that, and you were on top of that dealing with the disciplinary questions and the anticipation of issues with drugs and everything else, to simply say there's lots of jobs out there is just completely unreasonable. And so as much as we want to look at issues of stereotype, and I don't want to minimize the stereotyping issue, there are far larger structural questions that underlie most of what we're talking about.
I agree. Historically, business development was seen as an equal, if not superior, road to racial equality in terms of quality of life as legal and political. Is race still an impediment to starting a successful business by being able to achieve maybe access to capital?
I guess that's an area that I can address being in business. The issue of starting a successful business, I think, is separate from the assumption that was made in the beginning of that statement. The statement said that, again, historically, starting a business was seen as a method, a route to achieve equality, to achieve the ability to control one's destiny, if you will. As it's turned out, blacks have been extremely successful in starting businesses. Again, the statistics suggest that over the last decade, the black rate of starting businesses is almost 5 times that of any other ethnic group. The problem is those businesses aren't transcending, they're transactional. And what I mean by that, I think some 1.9 million black businesses, 1.8 million of them have no employees. So essentially you have self-employment and not really wealth creation. Wealth creation allows you to transcend. Wealth creation allows you, again, to sustain a number of families beside your own. Wealth creation allows you to accumulate capital in a capitalistic society. It's not really the businesses per se, it's the capital that you hold. Race and a number of other factors have been, to a large extent, prevented us from accumulating capital, from accumulating wealth. And so I think to some extent, coming out of the civil rights movements and the thrust of the 60s and the emphasis on starting businesses has to some extent been to the community's detriment, because it's kind of taken our eye off of the fact that having a lot of us starting businesses, but essentially just working for ourselves instead of working for someone else, doesn't really follow that route towards, again, achieving economic equality as well as racial equality. Again, we aren't really transcending.
How do you see access to capital contributing to that? Access to capital for these businesses, how do you see it contributing to that?
Traditionally, as we look at impediments to, and just not blacks, all minority, the assumption has been that, again, we didn't have access to capital, we didn't have capabilities in terms of managerial experience. Again, we were undereducated. Quite honestly, if you look at kind of the statistics, it really isn't access to capital in a formal sense. It's access to networks. And what I mean by that, years ago when I finished my degree at Purdue, I was flying back from Atlanta with a very nice older gentleman. I told him what I was doing my research in black entrepreneurship. And he said some words that stuck with me even to this day. He says, the main problem with African Americans starting businesses is that they simply don't know enough rich people. And that stuck with me because traditionally our movement, our efforts is to try to get banks access to capital, try to get formal access to loans. That's not where capital comes from. Capital comes from the venture world. Capital comes from individuals who reinvest their funds into startup capital, and we don't have access. Capital comes from your church member or someone who really knows how hard of a worker you are, how good your idea is to invest in you. And we aren't linked in to those capital networks. It's not the formal access of banks and government lending. It's the informal access to networks that reinvest their capital, and that's what we don't have access to.
Thank you. According to our March 2012 issue in the New York Times, the U.S. Department of Education found only 29% of schools highly populated with minorities offer advanced classes such as calculus. How does such finding impact people of color's opportunity to obtain high-paying jobs in the science, technology, engineering, and math fields?
Well, clearly then it results in fewer people of color in the STEM fields. They're underrepresented in the science, technology, education, and math. Statistics show that 72% of STEM jobs are held by white individuals, and that actually matches their overall representation in the US workforce, which is about 68%. Asian Americans make up about 14% of all STEM workers, but only represent 5% of the US workforce. So here, almost 3 times as many Asians hold STEM jobs compared to their overall representation in the workforce. However, when we look at blacks and Hispanics, they account for only 6% of STEM workers. And yet, there's 12% of African Americans in the United States and 14% of Hispanics. And so clearly they're underrepresented, and that obviously results in them making substantially less money. If you're going to be in the STEM fields, you're often going to make much more money compared to others who are in non-STEM occupations. And so it's already been touched upon how education really is a gateway to high-quality STEM jobs. Therefore, we need to enable and encourage equitable access to premium education to ensure that everyone has, so that there's a diverse source of STEM professionals, which will ultimately help advance the U.S. innovation and global competitiveness.
Thank you. So do you think it's important to learn more about the history, cultural, religion, and ethnic background of all Americans as a regular part of our K-12 education system, and how will such information contribute to the reduction of stereotypes in our country?
So I'll try that. I like to point, I guess my quick response to that, I think that's important. I don't think that's going to address, I think John had mentioned it, some of those structural issues. I think Ted's comment with respect to the criminal justice system and some of those structural issues that, and what I mean by that, again, we're in a church and we seem to be people of faith. There's a scriptures that says, again, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, that our issues aren't really with each other, but powers and principalities and rulers in high places. That there's this structural underlying nature of power, the way power is executed in this country. And so I think we need to make a distinction when we talk about racism and blending that into stereotypes. When I say that, as human beings, stereotyping happens to be a human, it's part of our human makeup. We had to make quick decisions. Is this thing going to eat me or can I eat it? And out of that, I mean, it's just part of human nature to make certain assumptions with respect to limited information. The problem is, do we have structural, from education and government, do we have structural institutions that limit our information about each other? So certainly, learning about each other's cultures, being exposed to each other, we won't make some of those assumptions. The video that we saw, in all fairness, I'm not sure what the statistics would have looked like if white kids had been in Compton okay, destroying a vehicle, okay, or those same black kids in a black neighborhood destroying a vehicle. And so is it racism, or is it, again, stereotypes? Is it tribal? But the key is, what I'm concerned is, what I call racism, is that the ultimate penalty for those white kids, if someone had stepped up, would have been they would have gone to jail. Okay, the ultimate penalty for those black kids is they could have been killed. And so again, the power structure is what makes the weight of stereotypes so disproportionate in that sense. And so as we look at this, until we recognize again that there are forces that all of us are grappling with, and we simply deal with getting to know one another. We're all going to be getting along at the kind of the bottom of this pyramid in a world that's again, I guess we've all read the end of the story, all right, that this world is headed towards a destructive end. And so, again, I think we have to address some of those structural impediments and not just how you and I treat one another. We certainly know that one-on-one we need to treat each other better, but racism comes in the disproportionate access to power, and that affects all of us.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. We are.
Can I add one more piece to that? You framed the question in terms of how we handle K-12 education. So I had to think about what I think about that a little bit. If I were thinking about just sort of what I want as a college professor, what I want of the students, I didn't warn Erica was going to do this, but I'd like this to be the last Black History Month that we celebrate. I'd like to celebrate some Black future.
Thank you. I think that we have time for one more very important question, which is, and this is one that I wish I wasn't a moderator but a panelist, do Americans influence the media, or does the media influence the American culture?
I think everybody may want to answer that, but I'll be quick. I think certainly both. I think America influences the media and media influences America. I think the challenge we have is, again, the power structure that's involved that leaves a disproportionate image about certain people. I believe that what the media really should do is we should put disclaimers under TV shows and movies that say, this is really BS. This is one example of America, but it is not, because we show in the media constantly certain images, and there needs to be disclaimers that really say this is not really the truth about all of America. And I think if we could do that, it might change at least that disproportionate power relationship, because so many people read and see the media, or not read, but look at the media and believe that this is how it really is. And we need disclaimers to say that isn't really, this is just a snapshot.
Thank you.
I would also like to say I agree. It certainly goes both ways. I do think society influences the media only in that it relies so heavily on the media to get much of its information. And so for me, speaking from a criminal justice background, the vast majority of people are getting their information about crime, justice, punishment from the media. However, the media certainly affects society, and I want to, again, speak about perceptions of crime. The media has determined that crime sells, right? So we're bombarded with images about crime every time we turn on the TV, turn on the radio, read the newspaper. And so what results is this results in fear of crime. Most people fear crime. Most regular citizens think that crime is on the rise, while in all actuality, crime rates have remained stable and even declined. But even worse, it can distort racial characteristics and actions of certain individuals. There was a study that was done in 2002 by one of my colleagues, and they examined media imagery of media stereotyping by white individuals who were engaged in prominent criminal cases. What they found was that when white individuals engaged in crime, a great deal of time and space was spent trying to figure out why. Why? Looking at trauma, looking at childhood abuse, looking at depression, mental health illness, psychological issues. A lot of space was spent trying to figure out what was the reason why the individual did it, because what's portrayed is they're non-criminal by nature. In contrast, African American men who offended were portrayed as animalistic, as aggressive, violent, and dangerous, and there was not much space or effort trying to figure out why, because what was implicit in that is it's expected. It's not surprising if it happens. But the other thing they found that was interesting was that white criminals tended to be romanticized. Often they were portrayed as being intelligent or heroic, and what would happen is it would actually garner sympathy by the readers. The readers would be able to identify with them and even admire them in some cases. And so, of course, all of this perpetuates racial stereotypes and really plays into the public sphere of crime.
Thank you.
I'd like to interject one thing regarding that. Again, I'm going to relate to personal experience. And one, having...
I just want to remind you that I am past my time, so be very sensitive to that.
Okay.
Thank
Having
you.
to deal with media in terms of public relations and how they create the perception of image of cities that I've been in, I've had to deal with them by them covering the negatives as opposed to the positives.
Right.
Not necessarily just race. But when it comes to race, I'm finding that when it comes to crime, such as drug use, school violence, the media over the last maybe 5-7 years have gotten better at showing the drug use in non-African American communities and schools, and also the school violence in non-African American schools, which is getting better. But one thing I've noticed there still is a deliberate attempt on behalf of some in the media to create this wedge which is preventing us from moving faster towards reconciliation. One point I want to make: Africa. I had an opportunity to go there, but when I was introduced with that opportunity, I said I didn't want to go. You know why? How many of you, what do you think of Africa? When you think of Africa, do you think of little babies with bones in their noses and giraffes and lions and tigers and snakes? Anybody want to raise your hand? Good. Okay, I did at that time about 14 years ago. That's all I thought because that's all I saw on television. And I get there and I see these.
You should have gone.
What did you say?
You should have gone.
I did go.
Oh, you did go?
Oh,
Okay.
my God, the high-rise
Right.
buildings, the bridges, and the nice vehicles and the homes and whatnot. But yet and still on their television set, what I saw was a black guy with a pink hat, a long pink coat, pink fur around his coat, and he had gold rings on every finger, gold chains, and he had a non-African American girl on each arm, and he had a pink Cadillac with a pink wheel on the back of it. This was just in 2001. So I happened to meet a queen over there that I wanted to date, and her dad didn't want me to date her because, and I have degrees and all that other, but his perception of us as African Americans was that we're drug dealers or womanizers, and so he didn't want me to get close to his daughter. But after some time, it did happen. But the barriers and the stereotypes that's put in the minds of people all over the world regarding African Americans is a challenge that we need to deal with.
Right. Can I say one more thing about the media? Sure. Okay, it's obviously that's a huge area, the whole idea of media and media influence. And one of the things I want to encourage us to look at when we look at that is the whole role of advertising, because no matter how much we might want to change the media, how much we might have these great ideas of how to do that, it is an economic issue and it is about money. And so it's about how much, is this show going to bring in? You can have all great ideas about what you might want, but if it's not going to produce any revenue, then we're not going to be interested. So we have to make our voices known, and that's what I think is exciting about social media, is that we can make our voices known a lot more now than we used to be able to. But it's not just the people who are producing the shows that you need to influence, it's the advertisers, because it's really run by advertising, and that's a really important, you can influence by influencing and advertising through social media.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the panelists. I'd like to thank Eric and Spring Arbor University for putting this together for Black History Month, but I also encourage you not to do this just during Black History Month. This is not the only time that we need to be bringing attention to this issue. This is an ongoing issue, which means that we have ongoing work that we need to kind of continue to do with this. And the African American community cannot do it alone. It takes all of us to work together. It takes all of us to pray, educate, and bring understanding to this issue. And I think all the ethnicities and all of us need to be together in one voice in order to make a difference in this issue. At this time, I'd like to welcome, Okay, well, before I do that, are there any questions for the panelists from the audience? There's a microphone in the back if you'd like to stand next to the microphone and ask your question, right behind you.
Well, actually, I have many questions, but I will just narrow it down to one. In as much as we're standing in the church and alluding to the comment that the gentleman on the end had made in reference that we wrestle against spiritual wickedness in high places, I think one of the primary issues that we have to focus on is that when the Bible indicates in Galatians chapter 3, verses number 28 rather, there is neither Jew nor Gentile. That eliminates racism. Bond nor free. That eliminates slavery. Male or female. That eliminates sexism. So, when you allude to the fact that we're now standing in the church, Dr. King said in 1963 that one of the most segregated days in America was on Sunday. Now, in the spirit of the Apostle Paul, when he was dealing with Peter, in reference to Peter separating himself from the Gentiles whenever the Jews would come around. So Paul says to Peter that you are to be blamed. So the assumption that there isn't any blame to go around in reference to the plight that most minorities find themselves in is we would be fooling ourselves. The fact is that as Christians, we have a responsibility to fight against the very spirit of racism and segregation. That is our obligation, that is our responsibility. To say that I'm a Christian and then not recognize that my brother and sister is being mistreated regardless of the color of their skin, and to stand by and not recognize that I have a responsibility and an obligation to do something about the treatment of the individual as a Christian, there's no way in the world that we can get away with that. So allowing people, it's not necessarily a black issue or a white issue, it is an American issue. The fact that you are an American and you're being mistreated, because I have the same obligation to come to the rescue of my brother and sister regardless of his color. So we have to have that, we have to take on that responsibility. If we're going to say that we're Christians, then we have to move outside of the church and we have to recognize and call right, right, and wrong, wrong. And as much as Paul recognized the fact that Peter was an apostle, he had an obligation to say to him, you're creating confusion. You're causing people to look at your behavior and they're responding to your behavior and they're doing the exact same that you're doing. When the Gentiles come around, they're withdrawing themselves so that they don't get in trouble with the Jews. So we have that same responsibility. We don't want to be the ones that are creating racism, creating division, but we should be coming together to create unity.
Thank you. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Okay. Professor Ransaw, did I get that right? Yeah, what you were saying about just some of the products that prisoners in jail produce. I've heard similar stories. We can all probably relate to the image of prisoners making license plates, but I've read about other things such as the uniforms that our soldiers in the military wear. Those are produced by prisoners. So my question is there any credence to the claim that the prison complex is an industrial complex? And if so, to what extent is racial discrimination a source of profit?
My brother, that is a great question. I don't know how I can make that short. She said, please try. Okay, I will try. All right, let me give you a really clear example. Some of the United States has more prisoners in the United States than the rest of the world. As many people as in China, we incarcerate more people just in the South than the entire country of China. In the South, some of the same prisons are on former plantation land who incarcerate a lot of African American males, and some of the prison guards are descendants of the slave owners on that same property. But to push on that, is it an industry? There's a movie that came out called Escape with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Stallone. Have you seen it? Yeah. If you haven't seen it, this is a pretty good movie. But anyway, just wanted to give you some reference. And he talks about this, and just very briefly. Every prison actually has to have a community around it, a support system. So when a prison goes up, they have to have supports for that. So beds for people to come to stay when they visit prisoners, they make food, there's a whole bunch of other things. So there's actually economies that cities are built around prison to support prison staff, lunch breaks, things of that nature. But interestingly enough, I know for a fact in Texas, they have prisoners build the prison, make the soap, make the barbed wire, and make the clothes from top to bottom. And in addition to that, usually when you get a prison, or usually when you make a prison, prisons get tax benefits and tax cuts and incentives to build prisons. So is it an industry? Yes, it is a billion-dollar industry. And one of the things that the United States does better than any other country in the world is profit from prison industry.
Do you mind if I ask a quick follow-up question, or?
Go ahead.
I don't mind.
Very quick.
Great. So it sounds like, if this is the reality, that there are people who stand to profit from structural inequality, and they want to sustain that equality, how does that change the process of combating racial discrimination and stereotyping and inequality today? Because it's easy for all of us to say, of course, we want to be equal. We want to treat others morally and with respect and dignity, as all of us could. But what if it's more than a race issue? Could it be a class issue? And maybe Dr. Hawthorne, you might want to touch on that.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that it's more of a class issue than race, and I think that class has been one of the defining things in the United States. I personally feel that slavery in the United States had a lot more to do with social class and economics more so than it had racism, and that came along afterwards. But to answer your question, so what people ask me all the time as an educator, what's the solution to educate? Well, what's going on with education? I can't believe this and that. My answer to that is the education system is designed to do exactly what it does. We have been told that the education system is equal and everyone has equal access and opportunity, but the fact of the matter is the school systems are not set up for everybody to go to college. It's not set up that way. And so the school system is formed to do exactly what it was created to do, and if more people have been placed in prison, usually have a lower education level, then I think that says a lot about society. Not saying I think it's a conspiracy or it's all against African Americans. I do think that's a lot to do with it. But I think, just like you said, A, it's a prison industry, but two, or B, that I definitely think that class has a lot to do with incarceration and what's going on with African American males in prison.
Just really quickly, the related issue about how to unwind some of this stuff industrially. I think of small towns in upstate Michigan who benefit heavily in a community for all the support services that he was talking about in terms of restaurants and stores and hotels and people live and jobs, jobs for correctional guards. If you thought about significantly reducing prisons, it has major economic impacts on the subsidiary communities. And that's why we've got to think of this in much more systematic notions than we have. And it's been, I think, in my personal judgment, it's been our neglect of those systemic issues that contributed to exactly where we are right now.
Thank you.
Can I get 1 second? Really, it's amazing. What would happen, because it costs more money to incarcerate someone than it does to send them to school? If that makes sense, then it would also make more sense to, why don't we just educate people? Instead of building more prison, we would have better benefits. And so why we don't do that, I think, says a lot.
Next question, please.
I want to affirm that comment about capitalism and remind us that Dr. King, when he was killed, was speaking against capitalism as well as against war, but we forget that. Anyway, I'm Christine Peterson from the Jackson Area Civil Rights Awareness Association, and when you talked about should we teach other religions and cultures in school, I thought about my own education in school, and I thought, when we think about stereotyping, we think about blacks and inferiority, but you know what the stereotype I got? Is whites are superior. And that's the stereotype I think we need to take seriously and think about addressing.
Thank you.
Sorry. Okay. My question is, do you think that a more aggressive form of affirmative action in education would help to like alleviate some of the racism or stereotypes, like perhaps reparations in the form of education for all descendants of slaves or descendants of people who can prove that they have been discriminated against, or like not allow certain opportunities based off of their ancestry in this nation due to like grandfather clauses or whatever. Do you think that would be like a viable option for like lobbying for, or like would that be a solution to the problem or a partial solution?
I'm not an educator, but I think it might bankrupt America, though.
Well, Dr. Rawson just said that like it's cheaper to educate someone than it is to send them to prison. And I think that if we educated African American people that I know as a junior it's very difficult to attend university. My aunt told me when I was applying for this university to be careful who I chose as friends, because when you see black kids on campus, they're either freshmen or seniors because it's so difficult to stay in school financially. And I think that that's probably the most significant barrier preventing African Americans from achieving what they can be. And I think that if in the form of reparations or like taxes, even if we lobbied for, in the South, African American people weren't allowed to vote for years after Reconstruction, and I think that taxation without representation is against the Constitution, and if we even lobbied for that money to be put towards reparations or like any form of discrimination that can result in financial gain from class action suits.
I believe that Dr. Carter had a quick comment.
I think, you know, we can debate the legitimacy or the ability to follow that model, but certainly investing in education can have anything but a positive result. You know, to the extent though, if we think about, again, I go back to the structural issue, if all of us were in the STEM area, you know, it would seem, you know, those people that get educated in the sciences get higher incomes, get better jobs. You know, it's kind of a supply and demand. But think if all of us were engineers, all of us were computer science. What impact would that have? You would think, given the nature of this economy, you'd see companies like Microsoft and Facebook and others screaming and promoting and trying to provide scholarships to get more students, but that's not what they're doing. They're screaming at the government to let more folks get green cards, because I can get an engineer from India, okay, at 1/3 the salary that I can get an engineer from MSU or Michigan. And so it goes back to, again, you know, this structural, you know, Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand, you know, that no one is consciously trying to do harm to someone else. But as we all pursue our own self-interest, okay, harm just seems to follow. I call that, again, powers, principalities, and spiritual wickedness in high places. So you're right. You know, education is the key, but again, education collectively isn't the answer. Essentially, if all of us were engineers, we would just bring down the salaries of engineers. We'd be hopefully well educated, well trained, perhaps, but not necessarily is that the answer to kind of thriving and profiting across the board. And I don't want to suggest that education isn't good. I'm just saying that isn't the structural answer. By all means, you know, we want all of you to pursue a higher education. I think, again, I come back to pursue reconciliation and then pursue a higher education.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. Next question, please.
Can I encourage her? Miss, thank you so much for coming up. You're a junior. It was hard for me to make it through school. I had 2 jobs, and I do think we need affirmative action. I am a supporter of that.
But thank you so much for coming up. I really appreciate your comments.
Good evening. My name is Jeff Harold. I'm a Free Methodist pastor from Ann Arbor. And I heard the brother speak of the issues of principalities and powers and the whole issue of racism as sin. However, in my lifetime, I've seemed to have found that racism is the sin that defies conversion. And we can have folks that love Jesus and are as racist and prejudiced as they want to be, but they love the Lord. And we've talked about structures, we've talked about disproportionate sentencing, we've talked about access to capital, but what we have not talked about is white privilege. And I would like the panelists to speak to the issue of how they see stereotypes used in the maintenance of white privilege.
Well, he ended the sentence in a way I wasn't ready for, so I'm going to pretend you didn't say the last three words. Okay. I have wrestled quite a bit with this question, and I'm going to make the theological move of maybe not so much to powers and principalities, but to look at the importance of the Philippian passage where Christ thought it not an embarrassment to reduce himself. I think that's the dominant message for how you deal with white privilege. To recognize I have no privilege because I'm only indebted to Christ. That's who I am. That's what I am. And any privilege that came to me is a bonus I don't deserve, and I should be going out of my way. And I'm ashamed of the fact I don't do more than I do to try to act on that model of kind of reducing my own privilege as a means of example.
I don't know if this is answering the question, but as an example of, I think, with white privilege, a while back, Tim Wise came to Starr Commonwealth and spoke to a group of us, and he made a bunch of comments, and one of the things he said was that in America now, whites need to understand that they're at a disadvantage because the world, the American society is changing to such that eventually whites will be in the minority. And his argument was that they don't know anything about anybody other than themselves. And so he saw that as a disadvantage. And he was very open in sharing his aspects of what he saw was wrong about America as it relates to race. The point I made to him after his speech is white privilege allows you to say those things. If, part of the challenge is, as an African American, if you speak out too violently, too aggressively about race in America, you are often reverse labeled as a racist. And so part of the challenge for us and what makes it difficult is how do we get past that if you don't say anything, then you're often impacted by it socially, emotionally, psychologically. If you speak up, then you're often labeled a racist yourself. My point to him was, I listened to a speech and said, you're not saying anything that most African Americans in the room don't already know. But the fact that you can say those things and no one, wanted to, throw stones at you, I think is an indictment of what our society is about. Even when you're discussing what's wrong with America or race, you can do it if you're white. You can't do it if you're black oftentimes. So I think the challenge for us is where do we create or change that so that I can speak openly about race and not be labeled a racist because I'm sharing what I might think about it. I know that doesn't necessarily answer the question, but I think it's a complex question to answer. For us on the panel, it's difficult to, these are really, really complex and very difficult questions. But I do think that white privilege is, one of the things that works in many different ways. There's an example, white privilege might be this idea of executive presence, which is kind of an example where, white men are assumed to have executive qualities because they're white. And so as a result, people of color are often graded on, do you have enough executive presence, when it's often a given that white men have it. I mean, it's very, very challenging. Our society is one that's complex, it's challenging, but I think for us, race and all that comes with it, the biggest challenge for me is that we're segregated. We don't have more opportunity for discussions. We don't live together, we don't talk, we don't engage. And I think if we're going to have a better society, we have to begin to engage and really interact with each other more. And we don't. We live in one community, you live in another. That's part of what white privilege is. It allows you that right. We can't tell people where to live. And so often we choose to live with people who are like us.
Thank you. Next question.
Just going to say, I'm not sure if it's an answer or a solution, but I think one of the things when we talk about white privilege is perhaps change that word. When we look at kind of white privilege, the presumption is that there's an arrogance there. There's, in some sense, some feeling that they have rights to the things that they don't have. And the assumption is that you can somehow, through exposure, through reason, through education, perhaps through laws, you can begin to address that. Perhaps white privilege is a manifestation of extreme white fear. And fear is an extremely powerful emotion. And you have to come at it a little bit differently in terms of, it's one thing if someone feels they're superior to you and there's something inherent about them. It's another thing if really deep down they have great fear of you. You know, it's mentioned, you know, I don't think in the sense they may not know statistics, but, you know, I think they're very aware that globally, okay, you know, that, you know, the world is made up of people of color. There was an extremely controversial, and I'm not suggesting that it had a lot of scientific flaws, but the premise, there was an extremely controversial book in the 60s called the ISIS Papers. And the basic premise of that book was that fundamentally at the DNA level was this inherent desire to survive. And that looking at the white race, completely mixing, we're all equal, we're all the same, that the human race wouldn't lighten, the human race would darken, okay? And that fundamental reality caused this huge inferiority complex that was masked with a superiority. So to some extent, it's like I'm not saying, you know, calling my brothers and sisters, but I'm just saying sometimes when you get an angry animal that's gnashing and gnarling and barking, it's not out of their superiority, it's out of fear. And so, you know, I think we need, you know, it was very common for all of us in the joy of President Obama's election to say subtly, subconsciously, psychologically, young black kids can now, in a sense, feel like they could do everything, that this one act, again, had this deep psychological effect that the kids could aspire. Well, to some extent, you know, it might have a deep psychological effect on those of another race that said everything we thought about, everything we knew about the world is now changing. That's a kind of a frightening, and maybe a lot of this reaction, tea parties, et cetera, that we're getting is out of great fear. That's not a solution, but at least, you know, from both sides, you know, it begins to perhaps give us another way to approach looking at trying to bring the races together. That it's, you know, it's not an issue of they feel like they're very privileged, but it may be a recognition that, you know, they're quite fearful, or, you know, where's this world heading from the perspective of, from their perspective. Because complete equality, again, the world's not going to get lighter. The world's going to get darker.
Thank you, Dr. Carter.
Just run quickly, because it's a very important issue, and this is some practical ideas we can give some of the young students that are out here. But part of it, I believe, truly is fear, but the other part of it is an entitlement feeling of superiority, as the lady said. And I teach my daughter since she was a very young age, 1, I told her 3 things: that you're very smart, you're very beautiful, and you're very important. And now that she's a little older, she said, Daddy, I'm also very strong. So she threw that in there too. The point was that the Bible says that the man thinketh in his heart, so is he. So they begin to think that and feel that from early on in history. So part of it is fear, but part of it is entitlement, that their superiority complex exists because they believe that they're superior. okay? And when we find that in the workplace, for my own experience, we have to, as Christians, deal with that with love. And that's righteous indignation, which isn't going around physical, but is using our head. It's informing ourselves and becoming knowledgeable of the system. I was applied for a position as a city manager, but prior to getting that city manager position, I looked at what the previous city manager made. I looked at all of his benefits. When I was doing the interview process, they offered me $20,000 less than the previous city manager, no car, and lack of benefits than what he had. Because I'm an African American, perhaps they thought I was going to accept less, but because I was informed and educated, I brought up the fact that the previous city manager made $20,000 more than what you offered me. Vehicle, it wasn't a vehicle, I had 2 vehicles, wasn't a big deal, but it's the principle. So when we find that, we have to address it, we have to deal with that. And it's not going to change overnight, but we do have to deal with it and confront it when we see it.
That also goes for females, so.
Yeah, I believe that.
Yeah. Last question.
And I did get the money in the car and all that too.
There you go.
Well, hi, my name is Kelly Maxwell, and I'm a junior student here at a junior marketing major at Spring Arbor University. And I had a question that goes to Mr. Marsh. I am a resident of Inkster, and I was just wondering, or I actually read an article about the fact that I believe Inkster was the 10th most dangerous city in America. And I don't know where they rank now, but I was just wondering, where do you think that the problem lies with that, and what are you or the city of Inkster going to do to kind of help fix the problem?
I'm so glad you're here. I'll talk to you afterwards if we hang out.
Yes.
But one of the things we're doing is there's an image, and we're also dealing with the media. I've met with Channel 7, Channel 4, and Channel 2, because what they typically do, when there's something negative happening in Inkster, that's what they tend to focus on. Inkster crime rate has went down by 22% over the last year. They don't report on that. Inkster has not only the Inkster Police Department, but the state police and also the county police, where we have doubled the patrol in our community. They don't talk about that. It's a much safer place. And when they looked at the numbers, they didn't look at the true data when they put that information out there. So this is the responsibility of myself and our other leaders to tell our story. And I've met with the reporters of Channel 7, Channel 2, and Channel 4. I've outlined the initiative that we have in place, and they've said to me, Rich, we get it. We will begin to cover some of the great things happening in Inkster, and I wait to see that, because typically what media wants to do in some communities is focus on the negative as opposed to promote the positive.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to welcome to the stage Ambassador David Rawson to present the closing remarks.
And the point is, on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, our righteousness has got to be better than the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, who are pretty righteous people. And then he went down point by point, and the one point we think about is the one in Matthew 5:21 about murder. Lowest common denominator, he said, folks in the old days used to say, just don't commit murder and then we'll all get along with each other. But he said, I got to lift your vision to realize that if you hold anger in your heart, you're on that path. And if you say, you silly idiot, raka, to your brother, you're on that path. And if you call your brother a fool, you have put your feet on the slippery slope to hell. That's all stereotyping. Calling people fools, less than human. Never really understood this until I saw genocide in Rwanda. I was the United States ambassador to the Republic of Rwanda at that time. Here's a story. When I arrived in Rwanda, January the 5th, 1994, this beautiful country, these beautiful people, had torn themselves in two with hatred, with stereotyping, with prejudice. Two sides fighting each other, violence in the streets. Only a few months before had been actual combat between forces. When I arrived, I found out that in 12 days I was to host the top of all Rwandan society, including both sides of the struggle, in a Martin Luther Day reception. Something we did every year, and we're going to do it again. What do I do? And what do I say? Well, I began to read Martin Luther King in the early morning hours. That was my devotions. And when I stood up to speak, I said, I don't want you to hear me, I want you to hear Martin Luther King. And they heard it in French, and they heard it in their local language, Kinyarwanda. And we extracted from many of his famous statements, and he's talking about peace, and he's talking about living together. And when he's talking about white and black, they're hearing Hutu and Tutsi. And at the end of that, so many people said, that's us. That message is for us. We have got, but they didn't. Instead, they went back to their politicking, they went back to their political struggle, and it ended up in civil war and in genocide. One of my students last semester wrote a paper, and he said, justice may be a noun, but it really is a verb. It's action. You got to do it. And if you want to do it, if you want to work out against stereotyping, raka, you fool, all of which leads back to more anger, may I suggest
Great. Another hand for Dr. Rawson, Ambassador David Rawson. Thank you. Also, a hand for our panelists. Thank you for them. Thank you for them for being here today. Thank you all for being here today. This event could not have been without you. I'm thankful for Faye as well, coming all the way from Dearborn and spending time with us. Come on, give her a hand as well. She did a great job. Great job. So with that, we want to say thank you all for being here today, and certainly there's surveys in your hand. If you could just kind of jot down a few thoughts and just kind of drop them off in the backs as you go out. Thank you again, and certainly we'll be giving our panelists some gifts from the Spring Arbor University bookstore. Thank you again, and come on, give them a hand.